The Sword in the Stone, The Legend of King Arthur. Chapter 1. The Sword in the Stone. Uther Pendragon, King of all England, lay dying as the first snow of winter settled on the castle battlements of Camelot. The knights and nobles of England, kings from Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and powerful warlords from France surrounded his deathbed. In one corner of the room sat Uther's queen, Igraine, and their daughters, Margaux the eldest, and young Morgan le Fay. Closest to the bed stood Uther's most trusted men, the proud knights Sir Ulfius, Sir Brastias, and Sir Bordwin. The king was speaking in a dying whisper. "Who will rule my kingdom when I'm gone?" Most of the powerful men in the room were asking themselves the same question. Uther has no son, they thought. Who will be king when he dies? Some were already plotting to steal the kingdom for themselves. Suddenly the great oak door in the room swung open. Everyone's eyes turned. At first they could see no one. It was as if the door had opened by itself. Then a figure appeared, moving slowly out of the shadows of the doorway. It was a wizened old man. Snow covered his hair and long icicles hung from a wild grey beard. "Stand aside," said the ghostly apparition. "I must speak with the king." "Get out," said one knight. "The king will not speak with the likes of you." The chilly visitor was unknown to most in the room, yet 3 people knew him well. He was no stranger to Ulfius, Brastias, and Bordwin. "You had better let him pass," warned Sir Ulfius. The knight still stood in his way. "The king will not be bothered by this vagrant." The old man didn't seem concerned. "No matter," he said. With that he faded into the shadows and vanished completely. "A ghost!" shrieked King Anguish of Ireland. "A phantom!" cried King Lot of Scotland. "I am no ghost, even if some do call me a child of the devil," cried the old man. "I am Merlin." They turned around and saw, to their astonishment, that the figure had reappeared right beside King Uther's bed. Some of the knights reached for their swords, but Merlin simply raised his hands and froze the great iron blades in their scabbards. Pull as hard as they might, not one could remove his sword. "Now stand back," said Merlin. "I have private words to say to King Uther." The mightiest warriors in the land nervously shuffled back a few steps as Merlin's crooked body leaned over the king. He whispered a few words in the dying man's ear. Merlin's task done, he moved away from the bed. Knights and nobles alike moved aside as Merlin passed between them and disappeared through the doorway. A puddle of melted snow beside Uther's bed was all that was left to show that someone had been there. "I have heard the sweetest words," said Uther. "Merlin has made me happy in death." And with that, Uther, king of all England, died. All the knights, nobles, and kings returned to their castles, some to await news of who would be king after Uther, others to plan their attack on the kingdom. They gathered armies and ordered blacksmiths to their anvils to hammer iron into swords. They were not to know that Merlin was already at work, making a sword on his own anvil. The armies marched out to battle for the crown. From the north, from the east, the south, and the west they came. Soon the wintry snows covering England's green land were stained with blood. Death stalked the countryside. Battles were won and lost, and many thousands died. But no one man could gain control of Uther's Christian kingdom. Worse was to come, as heathen invaders from across the sea reached England's shores. The bloodiest of warriors, they burned down villages and hamlets, killed all the men and took the women and their daughters for slaves. "Who will save us now?" wailed sad voices from across the land as England bled. There was one person who had the answer, and he knew the time had come. Merlin flew by night to visit all the most powerful nobles. He sneaked into their dreams with a message. "Make your way to London on Christmas morning," he whispered, "and a new king will be chosen from among you. Merlin has spoken." As Christmas approached, the roads to London thundered to the sound of horses carrying the men who would be king. They gathered on Christmas morning at the largest church in the city and talked about their strange dreams. Everyone had heard Merlin's voice telling them to come to London. But how will the new king be chosen, they puzzled. They were still confused when they went into the church to attend the morning service. Afterwards, they walked out into the churchyard. "Look," cried Sir Ulfius, King Uther's loyal knight. "What's that?" In a corner of the churchyard, protected from the snow by a spreading yew tree, a huge marble stone had appeared. A great anvil of steel was set into it, and, stuck firmly in the anvil, was a gleaming sword. Sir Ulfius, Sir Baldwin, and Sir Brastias hurried across. "What sorcery is this?" said Sir Brastias. "This was not here when we went into the church." Just then Sir Ulfius noticed some words which had been inscribed in gold along the blade of the sword. The three men read them in wonder. "The man who pulls this sword from the anvil is the true-born King of England." "What does it mean?" asked Sir Brastias. "There's only one way to find out," said one boastful knight. "I will pull out the sword, and then I shall be the rightful king." The knight stepped forward and grasped the huge sword by the hilt. He pulled with all his strength. It would not move. He tried again, and eventually tumbled backwards with his effort, but the sword remained in the anvil. Another knight leapt forward, anxious to prove that he was the chosen king. But the result was the same. He could not free the sword. One by one, all the knights came forward to try and pull out the sword, and, one by one, they failed. "This is making fools of us all," said one. "This is nothing more than some magician's madness. Remember Merlin. He brought us here." "Mischief is afoot," said another. "We have been summoned here so that the heathen invaders can snatch our lands while our backs are turned." "'Tis no mischief," echoed a voice from the dark green yew tree. The knights looked up and saw the familiar figure of Merlin sitting on a thick bough. "The sword speaks the truth," said Merlin, "and the truth is that the one who will pull out this sword is not here yet, but he will come, and you will all witness who God has chosen to be king. And he will be more than King of England. He will become the warrior chief of all Britain. The kings of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales will all bow to him one day." The next moment Merlin vanished into the depths of the yew, the holiest of all the trees, and disappeared. "Now where has that maker of magic gone?" cried King Anguish of Ireland. "He is nothing but a troublesome sorcerer. Remember how he told us that he was a child of the devil? Come, let's be gone." Everyone left the churchyard and returned to their lodgings in the city to warm themselves and to begin their Christmas feasting. Merlin had no time for Christmas celebrations. He was waiting for a young lad to reach the city. Chapter 2. The Boy King. Later that Christmas morning, Sir Ector, a knight who had journeyed all the way from the north of England, reached the edge of the city. Riding beside him were his son, Sir Kay, and his foster son, Arthur, a young 16-year-old lad. As they looked down on the great city, Sir Kay suddenly realized that he had lost his sword. "Father," he said, "I cannot go into the city without my sword. Arthur must hurry back the way we have come and see if he can find it." Arthur spurred his horse and rode off to find the sword, but, try as he might to take the road they had come on, the horse would not follow it. Arthur pulled hard on the reins, but a stronger force than he was at work. The horse galloped toward the city, only stopping when it reached the churchyard. Arthur spotted the sword in the anvil. "My prayers are answered," said Arthur, dismounting and walking over to the stone. It was the finest sword he had ever seen, and he knew that his brother would be pleased to have it. Arthur did not see the shadowy figure smiling in the yew tree. He grasped the sword, and, with one pull, it was free. He didn't notice the inscription on the blade as he rode back to his father and brother. He found them talking to some other knights. "Brother, I have found you a wonderful sword," cried Arthur. One of the knights with his father gasped when he saw the sword. "Did you pull it from the anvil in the churchyard?" "Yes, my lord," replied Arthur. "Then 'tis nothing but mischief. You cannot be king," said the knight. "Me? A king?" answered a puzzled Arthur. Sir Ector turned to Arthur. "There is only one way we can prove this. We must go to this churchyard and see this anvil for ourselves." They rode into the city and reached the churchyard. Arthur replaced the sword in the anvil, and the others were summoned from their lodgings. Many came grumbling that their feast had been interrupted. Once more they all tried to pull out the sword, and again they all failed. "Now, Arthur," said Sir Ector, "it is your turn." Arthur stepped forward and grasped the sword. Everyone watched in silence as his fingers tightened around the hilt. It was done in an instant. The sword slipped from the anvil as easily as a battle-axe from butter. The onlookers gasped. Sir Ector sank to his knees. "Arthur, you are of more noble blood than I ever thought," he said. As they spoke, many of the other knights started to argue among themselves. "This youngster cannot be king," said some. Sir Ector turned to them and said that he believed Arthur was the rightful king. "But if you still don't believe it, let us return here at the festival of Candlemas and find out who can remove the sword, and between now and then a guard shall be mounted on the anvil to see that no magic or mischief comes about." At Candlemas they returned. Once more Arthur was the only one who could remove the sword, but still some of the lords refused to believe that he was meant to be king. Sir Ulfius spoke. "I, for one, am sure Arthur is the chosen one. But to convince the doubters, we will all return at Easter." Sir Ulfius was so convinced that he, Sir Brastias, and Sir Baldwin decided to stay with Arthur to await the final trial. They feared some ambitious warlord might try to kill Arthur. Those 3 knights, who had all served King Uther so loyally, never let Arthur out of their sight. The snows had melted, and the spring buds covered the hedgerows as the kings, knights, and nobles returned to London at Easter. The sword had been untouched since Candlemas. The knights tried their luck again, but it was all in vain. Arthur took his turn, but this time Merlin, hiding once more in the yew tree, stretched out his gnarled old fingers and pointed at the sword. Arthur grasped the sword. A blinding light danced along the length of the blade. The knights cried out in fear and hid their eyes from the dazzling blaze. When they looked again, they saw that Arthur now held the sword aloft. "Arthur is our chosen king," bellowed Sir Ulfius. "No one can deny it now." Everyone sank to their knees, many begging Arthur to forgive them for ever doubting him. The church was hurriedly prepared, and Uther's crown brought. Arthur was led to the altar. There he was first knighted by Sir Ulfius, and then crowned Arthur, King of England. Afterwards the nervous young man gave everyone a promise. He said that if anyone had lost their lands in battle since Uther's death, they would be returned, and if the heathen invaders have robbed you of anything, he said, then I will fight for its return. England will once again be one land and one people. King Arthur was escorted to the castle at Camelot. That night he lay awake, worrying about the task ahead. He was so young. How could he bring peace to the kingdom of England? How could he defeat the heathens? Merlin heard his lonely voice.